Week 3, Probation versus Parole versus Extended Supervision. The public and media are constantly confusing correctional terms. They call a state or federal institution a jail when it is actually a prison, and they call a county short-term detention facility a prison when it is actually a jail. And while the public confuses the terms prison and jail, they also tend to confuse probation and parole and extended supervision. I know they mean well, but here at least we'll all get on the same page and get our definitions right. Indeed, if you are employed in the state of Wisconsin as an agent, your title is probation or parole agent. You would most likely have a caseload with a combination of probationers and parolees. It is important to note some states administer corrections differently. Michigan and Illinois, two of our neighbors, have separate agencies that administer probation and parole. Parole agents are state employees. Illinois parole agents are armed, while probation agents are county employees. Illinois probation agents are unarmed. Here are some definitions. Probation is the conditional supervision of an offender in the community in lieu of or instead of incarceration. Parole is the conditional supervision of an offender in the community after he or she has completed a portion of their sentence confined in prison. Extended supervision is exactly the same as parole, except that it refers to the period of supervision after completing a prison sentence under Truth in Sentencing. For now, just remember that they couldn't call it parole because there is no parole board deciding when the offender is released from prison. The judge decides that at the time of the original sentencing. The old law. In Wisconsin, the old law refers to crimes that were committed on or before December 31st, 1999. Note that the key is when the crime is committed, not when the person is arrested, convicted, or sentenced. Let's say that our pal Joe committed his burglary on December 30th, 1999. All of the court proceeding rules would be under the old law, which in Wisconsin is an example of an indeterminate sentencing structure. This means that there will be a parole board that determines exactly when Joe will be released from prison. The old law schematic would look like: first, the day of sentencing, then at 1/4 is the parole eligibility date, then discretionary parole, then at 2/3 the MR or mandatory release date, and then 100% maximum discharge date. When a person is sent to prison under the old law, they must complete 1/4 or 25% of their total sentence before they are eligible to appear in front of the parole board and request that they be released. This does not mean that they will definitely get out. It is merely the first opportunity they have to apply for release. Before release is granted in Wisconsin, there are 5 criteria that must be met. If even one criterion is not met, the person will not be released and will be given a date when they can apply again for parole. The 5 Wisconsin criteria are: 1. Has the person met statutory eligibility? That is, have they actually completed 1/4 of their sentence? 2. Would release at this time endanger the community? 3. Has he or she served sufficient time for punishment? 4. Does the person have an adequate release plan? That is, has it been approved by the probation or parole agent? 5. What has the person's institution adjustment been like? Has he or she completed all the recommended treatment or programming? Has the person had any conduct reports? If so, were there major or minor conduct reports, and what were they for? Any time between 1/4, the parole eligibility date, and 2/3, the mandatory release, if the inmate appears before the board and meets all 5 criteria, they are granted a discretionary parole. They are then released to the community and will be supervised by an agent until they reach 100% of their sentence, or their maximum discharge date. If the inmate does not meet the 5 criteria for release and has reached 2/3 of the sentence, MR or mandatory release, they must be released from prison. They would then serve the last 1/3 of their total sentence out on the streets, supervised by the agent. Let's say that Joe received a 10-year sentence. The math is simpler. When Joe completed 2.5 years in prison, his parole eligibility date, he could then apply for parole. If he wasn't granted parole, when 2/3 was done, about 6.6 years, Joe would reach his MR, or mandatory release date, and would then be released. He would then be supervised until the 10-year sentence was over. While being supervised in the community, if Joe violated any of his rules or conditions of his supervision, his parole could be revoked and he would be returned to prison to serve the rest of his sentence, or a portion of it. The new law, Truth in Sentencing. Truth in sentencing was imposed in Wisconsin in 2000. The federal requirement for states implementing Truth in Sentencing, or TIS, was that inmates must serve at least 85%, up to 100% of their sentenced prison time. This is a form of determinate sentencing. In Wisconsin, this new law applies to any crime that is committed on or after January 1st, 2000. Let's say that Joe committed his burglary on January 2nd, 2000. He will now be sentenced under the new law. The judge must use the new sentencing requirements and must actually give Joe 2 separate sentences, called a bifurcated sentence. The incarceration sentence, Joe would get 6 years in prison. And the extended supervision sentence, Joe would have 4 years of extended supervision. In Joe's case, the judge still wanted the sentence to be 10 years, about the same as in the old law example, so he sends Joe to prison for 6 years. Joe must do the entire 6 years. He cannot be released early like in the first example. There is no parole board to decide when he is released. The judge decided that. Joe is then on extended supervision for another 4 years. He sees the same agent, he has the same conditions and rules. It's exactly the same as parole supervision. They just couldn't call it that because there is no parole board. They had to come up with another name for it.